Hi, it's Carrie from the Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine, and I'm joining you again from the Samuel Cohen Children's Room to share with you some more of our book, George, by Alex Gino and published by Scholastic. Chapter 9, Dinner at Arnie's. Mom didn't say anything in the car about the fight. Instead, she turned on a radio station that promised vintage modern rock and sang along with the choruses. When they got home, Mom suggested George wash up. In the bathroom, George combed her hair forward. If she squinted at the mirror, she almost looked like a girl. For now, anyway. Today, her skin was smooth, but someday testosterone would grow a terrible beard all over her face. Scott had already started to sprout awkward tufts under his chin. She brushed her hair back to its usual style and headed to her room to flop onto her bed. A few minutes later, a quiet knock came on her bedroom door. "Can I come in?" Mom asked. "Yeah." George sat up and Mom took a seat at the foot of the bed. "George, I'm going to be honest. I worry about you. There are a lot of kids like Jeff out there and plenty who are worse." Mom blew a puff of air up at her bangs. "I mean, being gay is one thing. Kids are coming out much earlier than when I was young. It won't be easy, but we'll deal with it. But being that kind of gay?" Mom shook her head. "That's something else entirely." "I'm not any kind of gay." At least George didn't think she was gay. She didn't know who she liked, really, boys or girls. "Then why did I find all those girls' magazines in your closet?" Mom raised an eyebrow and curved wrinkles formed across her forehead. George drew in a breath, held it, and then let it out. And then another. "Because I'm a girl." Mom's face relaxed and she gave a short laugh. "Is that what this is about? Oh, gee, I was there when you were born. I changed your diapers, and I promise you, you are 100% boy. Besides, you're only 10 years old. You don't know how you'll feel in a few years." George's heart sank. She couldn't wait years. She could hardly wait another minute. "Tell you what," Mom said, patting George's knee. "How about we all do something special tonight? Let's go to Arnie's." Arnie's all-you-can-eat buffet was George's favorite restaurant. You'll feel better once you're eating nachos and pizza and pie like a regular kid. For now, just chill for a bit. That's what I'm gonna do. George knew Mom was trying to make her feel better, but it didn't work. Nothing, certainly not a buffet dinner, could help the fact that Mom didn't see her. Mom took her laptop into the bedroom and came out only to refill her seltzer glass. Once again, George wished she had her magazines to look at. Instead, she watched cartoons on the sofa until school was over at 3. She knew it took Kelly about 20 minutes to get home on the bus, and sure enough, the house phone rang at 3:22. George picked up the cordless extension and headed to her room. "What happened to you?" Kelly asked, not bothering to say hello. "Everyone's saying you picked a fight with Jeff, but I told him that was impossible because you've never been in a fight in your life, and that Jeff must have been the one to start it. I mean, really, who's gonna pick a fight, you or Jeff?" "What did he do to you? Are you okay? I mean, obviously you're not in the hospital or anything, but man, they said he got you good. And did you really throw up on him? Because seriously, that might be the funniest thing I've ever heard in my life." Kelly was so loud that George could feel the phone vibrate. She held it a few inches from her ear and waited until Kelly was done. "Are you there?" Kelly asked. "Yeah." "Yeah, what? Yeah, you're there? Yeah, you threw up on Jeff? Or yeah, you picked a fight?" "All 3. "What the heck, George? What are you doing picking a fight with the biggest bully in our class?" "I don't know. He made fun of Charlotte, I guess." George's reasoning sounded foolish, even to her. "Charlotte's not even real." "Yeah, but if you're not going to be transgender and all, you're going to have to if you're going to be transgender and all, you're going to have a lot If you're going to be transgender and all, you're going to have to be a lot more careful. You won't be able to throw up on every bully you meet." "I could try," said George. "Blah, blah, blah." "You sound like a vomiting machine gun." "I could be a superhero." "You'd be Ralph the Ralpher. You could even have a motto: if you throw up, I'll throw down. If you throw down, I'll throw up." George and Kelly chuckled, But then a quiet fell over the conversation, and the only sound that came through the phone was the airy hum of the line itself. "That play really means a lot to you, doesn't it?" asked Kelly, breaking the silence. "It's just," George sighed. "I just thought that, if I were Charlotte in the play, my mom might see that you're a girl." "Yeah," said George. It felt funny to hear Kelly call her a girl, but in a good way, like a tickling in her stomach that reminded her she was real. "Well, maybe it's not too late," said Kelly. "I mean, the play hasn't happened yet, has it? But you got the part." "There are 2 performances, silly. I could take one and you could have the other." "You'd do that for me?" "Of course I would. I thought about it the whole bus ride home. I can make sure Dad comes to the afternoon show. You could totally do it. In fact, you make a better Charlotte than I do." It was true. George had listened to Charlotte's lines enough times that she knew every word, and she knew just how she would say them, mostly like Kelly did, but different in a few key places. Kelly emphasized some of the wrong words, and she still sometimes flubbed Charlotte's first line by saying salutations instead of salutations. But how? It's easier than easy. You already have to be dressed in black as a stagehand. All you have to do is put on the arm vest and you look perfect. As Charlotte, Kelly wore black leotard and tights, along with a vest with 3 stuffed arms sewn on either side. But Miss Udall already said I couldn't have the part. You know what? Miss Udall is wrong. You should be Charlotte, and by the time she realizes it's you, it'll be too late. You'll already be on stage, and there won't be a thing she can do about it. George could practically hear the devious grin on Kelly's face, and she could certainly feel the grin on hers. With Kelly's help, maybe she really could be Charlotte. But what about when the other kids notice? Forget the other kids. Jeff won't be there, and no one else will care. What about my mom? I thought showing your mom was part of the idea. Kelly's shrieking voice hurtled through the phone. Yeah, but George's stomach flopped. Look, do you want your mom to know you're a girl? Yes. Then be Charlotte. Kelly said it as if it was choosing strawberry ice cream instead of chocolate. I gotta go. I still have 1 performance to rehearse for, and now, so do you. 1, 2, 3, zoot! George hung up and twirled around the house like Charlotte spinning a glorious spiderweb. She, George, was going to be Charlotte on stage, in front of Mom and everyone. The butterflies in her stomach had butterflies in their stomachs. Scott leaped out of Randy's house the moment Mom honked the horn, as though he'd been waiting at the doorknob. He filled the car with a rant about his history teacher, followed by a tirade about his math teacher, and a torrent about his biology teacher. That man wants us to dissect a worm. I would think you would find that gruesomeness appealing, said Mom. Not if I have to diagram every last body part to scale. It's going to be a pain in the butt. If I'm going to diagram something, why can't it at least be a frog? That would be cool. If you think it's hard on you, just imagine how the worm feels. George was glad that Scott was diverting Mom's attention. She didn't want to be asked why she was smiling after being beaten up and sent home from school, but she was ecstatic about the idea of playing Charlotte on stage, and it was hard not to show it. Mom turned into Arnie's all-you-can-eat buffet and rolled into a spot facing the building. Red awnings with thick green borders hung across the wide windows of the large, squat building. A long banner stretching across the front of the restaurant proclaimed, "Over 100 items cooked fresh every day." Inside, happy eaters sat at booths and tables, their plates filled with food foraged from a dozen different cuisines and heaps of each person's favorites. No one waited on tables at Arnie's, and no one waited for their meals. Instead, endless buffet trays lined one long wall of the restaurant. People dressed in all white carried out full trays of food to the buffet and brought empty trays back into the kitchen, tables filled with soda and lemonade glasses. Mom paid at the door and unleashed her children on the buffet while she found a table. George filled her plate with fried chicken, mashed potatoes, corn fritters, pizza, a pile of nachos, and a cube of cherry jello hidden under a taco to eat while Mom was getting her own food. Even at Arnie's, Mom said you should have dinner before dessert. George went back to the table while Mom took her turn at the buffet. Scott sat down soon after. "What's up with Mom?" he asked behind a plate piled high with ham, turkey, and chicken, topped with 2 slices of pizza. "She never takes us out to Arnie's on a weekday unless she's upset about something." Yeah, well, George looked over at Mom, who was still picking out lettuce for her salad. I kind of got into a fight at school. Scott's head shot up in surprise, and his brow grew heavy. When I got into a fight in school, I got grounded. How did you work Arnie's out of it? I kind of also told her something. It must have been big. Mom staring at the beets like a zombie. It was. Did you tell her you were gay? Scott twisted his fork into a pile of mashed potatoes. You know, I'm okay with that, right? Before Dad left, he made me promise to take care of you. He said you were like that. I'm not gay, George said. Why did everyone think she was gay? Whatever, I don't care. My friend Matt is gay. It's no big deal. But it was a big deal. I told her I think I'm a girl. Oh, that was all Scott said at first. Oh. Scott chewed, swallowed, and took another bite of pizza. The background noise of the restaurant throbbed in George's ears. She wished Scott would say something, even if it was mean. Oh. Scott took a bite of turkey. Oh. Scott began to nod slowly. He turned to George, whose stomach had jumped with each oh, and now was nearly in her throat. That's more than just being gay. No wonder she's freaking out. I know. Scott put down his fork. So, do you? Do I what? Think you're a girl? Yes. George was surprised at how easy that question was to answer. Oh. Scott ripped a chunk of roll with his teeth and chewed thoughtfully. Mom returned with a green salad topped with raw vegetables and vinaigrette dressing. She finished it quickly and dropped her plate off in a dish bin. Mom always started her meal at Arnie's with the salad. She said it was healthy, not to mention delicious, but she always ate it quickly and then returned with a plate just as decadent as George's and Scott's. Scott gnawed silently on a chicken wing while Mom ate her salad, but once she got up and approached the appetizer bar, he dropped the bone onto his plate. I know about your magazines, he said. Mom told you? Nah, I found them this weekend. I knew Mom was upset about something, and then I saw the bag sitting on her bed. Dude, I thought you had porn or something in there, so I took a peek. You know, just to find out what kind of stuff my little bro was into. So I figured you were gay, but I didn't think you were like that. Scott popped a corn fritter into his mouth. So, like, do you want to... He made a finger like scissors. Go all the way? George squeezed her legs together. Maybe someday, she said. Weird, but it kind of makes sense. No offense, but you don't make a very good boy. I know. Mom returned to the table and the conversation was dropped. All three of them stuffed their faces until they dragged their very full stomachs to the car, groaning all the way, much like Templeton the rat after his night of indulgence at the fair. All three of them crashed in front of the television when they got home and watched a sitcom about a family with 12 kids. The jokes focused mostly on on the empty fridge and the full bathroom. George wondered what it would be like to live with so many people. Maybe each kid got noticed less. With Mom eyeing her from her chair, George wondered whether maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Scott snuck glances her way too, but whereas Mom's eyes were filled with concern and confusion, Scott looked at George as if his sibling made sense to him for the first time. George had never been gladder to have an older brother. Chapter 10, Transformations. George wasn't sure Jeff would be back at school, and every morning, as she kept nervous eyes out for the first sign of his spiky hair, when she finally spotted it, Jeff was already headed in her direction with a sneer across his face. He walked at a steady pace, his eyes steeled in the distance beyond George. He didn't break his stride for an instant, but spit at her feet as he passed. Every time he passed her that week, he spit. Real spit that landed on the pavement if they were outside, pretend spit on the linoleum floors if they were inside the school. The morning of the play, the students of room 205 chatted and laughed, leaving their bags on the desks and ignoring the assignments on the board. Only Miss Udell's threat to cancel the play quieted the class, and even then she struggled to wrangle her students through a morning of reading, journals, math, and vocabulary. Kelly and George exchanged knowing glances throughout. After recess, Miss Udell and Mr. Jackson brought their classes to the auditorium. Kindergarten through third grade students filed noisily into the old wooden seats for the afternoon performance. Parents and relatives sat in the first few rows. Isaiah, the boy from Mr. Jackson's class who was playing Wilbur, frolicked heartily, getting into character. The cast and stagehands gathered with Miss Udell backstage. The rest of the class went to sit in the auditorium with Mr. Jackson. It was dark behind the thick red cloth that draped the stage, and the air smelled musty. But once the curtains were pulled, the light from the auditorium windows would fill the stage. After the audience was seated, the overhead light flicked twice, signaling quiet. The curtains squeaked open, and Jocelyn walked on stage. The girl from Mr. Jackson's class was playing Fern, and she carried a blanket in her arms, meant to represent the runt pig, Wilbur. For this scene, Wilbur didn't have anything to do or say but to be saved from Pa's axe, and Isaiah was too big for Jocelyn to hold him in her arms. The first narrator began to speak, and the play had begun. When it was nearly time for Kelly's first line, she stepped up the ladder, carefully holding her extra limbs in her hands. She gave her opening speech, which went perfectly. She even said salutations the right way. The audience was focused on her every move. She spotted her dad and winked at him. Then she climbed down to wait for her next scene. "You were great," George whispered when Kelly was back on the ground. "You're going to be even better," Kelly whispered back. George said nothing but pictured herself on stage at the top of the ladder, sharing Charlotte's words with the audience. The play was short, over before most of the younger students began to squirm in their seats. At the end, the actors took their bows, and Miss Udell thanked the members of the audience for their time. Once the younger students had filed out, Miss Udell spoke to the fourth graders and the family members in the audience. "Students who are performing this evening, please be back at 5:30. The play will begin at 6 sharp. Parents and family, I hope you will stay for the PTA meeting that will follow." A few parents coughed in response. George knew that coughing was the adult equivalent of groaning. Families congratulated the performers at the front of the stage. Kelly's dad had even brought a bouquet for her. He and other parents left with their children. Miss Udell escorted the remainder of the class back to room 205 for the final 20 minutes of the day to write in their journals about the excitement of the theatrical experience, which was what Miss Udell wrote on the board in large letters. George wrote a single sentence on her page. It was exciting to help out with the play. But what she really wanted to write was, "I'm going to be Charlotte." Mom arrived home right when it was time to head to school for the play. She didn't even bother to remove her shoes. "Ready to go?" she asked. Scott was at Randy's house for the evening, supposedly working on a school project. George suspected that they were most likely watching gore flicks, but either way, she was glad Scott wasn't coming to the play. He had shown surprising tact until now, but if he said the wrong thing to Mom, he could really freak her out. George got up from the spot where she had been flopped on the couch for the last hour, barely noticing the talking dogs and superhero kids who flashed by on the television screen. She had bigger things on her mind. She put on her dress shoes, the only pair of black shoes she owned. When she was handing the spiderweb signs up to Kelly, her white sneakers hadn't mattered much, but if she was going to be Charlotte, she wanted to do it right. As Mom pulled out of the driveway, George's stomach turned nervously. She counted telephone poles to relax. "So how was the afternoon performance?" Mom asked. "It was okay." George was used to counting while Mom talked. She held the tens of her fingers to keep track. "That really sells it for me." "Sorry, Mom, I was just thinking." The ride to school wasn't long, so if George missed a poll, she might not have another chance to get up to 100. She supposed she didn't really need an imaginary electric fairy to go through with her and Kelly's plan, but it seemed safer that way. "I'm excited to see you take a bow this evening, even as a stagehand, and Kelly will be great as Charlotte, I'm sure." George didn't correct her. Mom would find out about the plan soon enough, and by then it would be too late to stop it. George reached 100 telephone poles with blocks to spare. The tiny school parking lot was full, so Mom found a spot on a street a block away. "Looks like it's going to be a big audience," Mom said. "Guess so," George shrugged, trying to ignore the fear that coursed through her. At the door of the auditorium, Mom kissed George on the cheek and searched for a seat. George could hear the students gathered backstage. The red curtain was heavy, and she fought her way through. The backstage lighting was dim, and George's eyes blinked to adjust. Most of the cast and crew were already assembled. "There you are!" Kelly skipped over to George. George grinned. They both wore all black. The only difference between their costumes was the vest of stuffed spider arms that Kelly wore. They shared secret smiles and giggles until it was nearly time for the show to begin. George shook with excitement. "This is it, ladies and gents," said Mr. Jackson, gathering the cast and stagehands together. "Let's make Mr. E.B. White proud one more time. Best performance and best behavior. Break a leg, Miss Udall said with a wink. Take your places and we'll get this show on the road. Mr. Jackson twirled his index finger in the air. Miss Udall took the side steps off the stage and sat down in the first row of the audience. Mr. Jackson stayed backstage to oversee the performance. The play began just as it had in the afternoon. The curtain rose on Fern Arable holding a blanket in her arms, cooing to a pretend piglet, and the audience applauded. The first narrator described the Arable's farm and told the audience about the baby pig who was moments from execution. Backstage, Kelly took off her vest and spider arms and handed it to George, who checked to make sure that Mr. Jackson wasn't watching. Then she donned the vest. The fake arms were filled with cotton and didn't weigh much, but they were bulky. George had to bunch them up in her real arms, as she had seen Kelly do, to make sure she didn't trip over them. She combed her hair forward with her fingers, as she had done countless times in the mirror, and waited. The opening scenes of the play had never been so slow. George was bouncing on the balls of her feet with nervous excitement by the time the barnyard animals began to greet Wilbur. Charlotte's first lines were only moments away. George climbed up the ladder to appear above the backdrop in full view of the audience. "Salutations!" George called out. Her voice was loud and clear, but with a soft lilt that showed Charlotte's kindness. She looked down to see Kelly holding the ladder steady with one hand as she took pictures of George with the other. George heard a gasp on stage below her, and then another, but she kept going. She explained to the animals what salutations were. She smiled and waved to Wilbur and to the audience, as if she were saying hello to the world. The audience smiled back. A small kid even waved. Miss Udall sat in the middle of the front row, frowning, just as she had in the hallway after George's audition. George looked away. She looked for Mom to see her reaction, but couldn't find her in the crowded auditorium. The rest of the audience was watching her, waiting for Charlotte's next line, and George didn't disappoint. Every word sounded just as she'd rehearsed it. She didn't make a single mistake. She felt like she was floating. At the end of the scene, George climbed back down the ladder. Her body felt as light as air, and she wasn't completely sure her shoes were touching the ground. Kelly squeezed her from behind, grabbing the cotton arms along with George's waist. "Wow, George, that was awesome," she whispered. "Really?" "Thanks." George beamed a goofy, unfocused grin. "You were totally like a girl." Kelly took George's hands, one of her real ones. "I mean, you totally are a girl." Kelly hugged her best friend tightly. Jocelyn walked up to them, her fists in tight balls. "You can't just do that," she whispered loudly. "Why not?" Isaiah whispered back. "Yeah." Chris crowded into the huddle backstage. "Why not? He was good. Better than Kelly even." "No offense, Kelly." Kelly shrugged. "I wasn't that great." "But it's disrupting to the other actors," said Emma. Most of the narrators had joined the circle around George, as had a few of the barnyard animals who were supposed to be clucking and mooing on stage. Rick remained by the curtain rope and said nothing. "Hush!" Mr. Jackson approached the group and herded it away from George and Kelly. The side curtain moved and Miss Udall stepped backstage, her face in a scowl. She headed towards George, but Principal Maldonado appeared directly behind her and put a hand on Miss Udall's shoulder. Then she whispered something in Miss Udall's ear. Miss Udall looked at George, Kelly, and finally Principal Maldonado. She raised a finger and opened her mouth, but then she stopped. She looked over at the play, still in progress, and the audience beyond. She gave a weak smile to Kelly, an even weaker smile to George, then stepped off stage. Principal Maldonado gave George a subtle nod, more with her eyelids than her chin, then she stepped off stage as well. By then, it was nearly time for Charlotte's next scene. George climbed carefully up the ladder and waited quietly for her cue. The play passed by quickly, and yet it seemed to George as though she had been on stage since the beginning of time, as if she were born there and only now found herself where she had always been. Wilbur performed his silly antics. Templeton raced around to gather sesquipedalian words. The geese clucked around and were generally a nuisance. It was like a real barnyard on stage. And at the center of it all, Charlotte proved her friendship and wisdom. George reveled in every moment, sharing her voice with the audience and watching them watch her as they waited for her next words. It wasn't long at all before George gave Charlotte's final speech. Charlotte was dying. It was the way of things, and she could do nothing but accept her fate. The sadness in George's voice came from deep inside. She knew her moment on stage was nearly over. "Goodbye, Wilbur," she said as her last words floated into the audience and out of reach. Before she could bear to step down from the ladder, George looked up. Sad faces filled the audience, and younger kids wiped their eyes on their sleeves. Still, she didn't see Mom. The moment George reached the ground, she cried too. She slumped against the backstage wall, hugging her knees, and she cried in sadness and joy. Charlotte was dead, but George was alive in a way she had never imagined. She watched the remainder of the show from the side of the stage in a heady post-performance glow. Soon, the audience began to clap. Someone grabbed George's hand and brought her into the line of performers. Everyone bowed in unison. Then the human characters moved up for a second bow. The applause grew stronger as Chris, who had played Templeton, stepped forward. Isaiah hopped onto his hands and knees to oink like a pig once more, to laughter and even more applause. George felt someone push her gently, and she let her feet guide her to the front of the stage. The auditorium was filled with hands clapping louder than ever. She blinked a few times and then saw Miss Udall motioning for her to bow. George looked on the crowd and did the only thing that made any sense. She curtsied. She wore no skirt to hold daintily, but she didn't need it. She was graceful, and she held onto the moment as tightly as she could, even after the curtains were pulled shut. The class clapped and hooted and howled. A few kids patted George on the back. "Way to go," they said, and "You were awesome." "Congratulations to you all," Mr. Jackson cried as he stepped out from backstage. "You were fantastic, including our surprise star." Mr. Jackson smiled at George. "Now, there are a lot of excited families here, eager to congratulate you. I suggest you get out there." George worked her way through the split in the curtain and surveyed the audience. Kids weaved around, finding their parents and saying goodnight to their friends. Chris recreated some of his favorite moments. Kelly bounced around, taking photos. Nearby, her father gave George a giant thumbs-up sign. In the back, Rick slipped out of the auditorium door. He had come alone. George wondered whether he would say anything to Jeff. George heard her name coming from kids talking to their parents, as well as the word boy. Adults' heads turned her way. Most looked at her with open faces of surprise. A few smiled and waved. Others crinkled their faces in disgust. George stepped off stage and out of the view of staring eyes. Mom made her way up the main aisle. Her stern face stood out in the crowd. George felt as though she were frozen in place. "Well, that was unexpected," Mom said. "I didn't even know it was you at first. I thought it was supposed to be Kelly, but then I realized I was seeing my son on stage, and everyone in the audience thought he was a girl." George's lips quivered, but her voice was clear. "I did too." "Did what?" A bit of Charlotte's confidence still coursed through her. "I already told you. I am a girl." Mom's face turned to stone and her mouth grew small. "Let's not talk about this right now." George noticed Principal Maldonado heading toward them, a soft smile on her face. "Congratulations! You were wonderful," she said to George, then turned to Mom. "Your kid was great tonight. You just may have a famous actor on your hands someday." "Thank you," Mom smiled politely. "He certainly is special." "Well, you can't control who your children are, but you certainly can support them. Am I right?" Principal Maldonado's earrings sparkled in the auditorium light. "Excuse us," said Mom, searching awkwardly in her purse for some imaginary item, "but we've got to get home to dinner." "Well, make sure the star gets extra dessert tonight." Principal Maldonado put her arm around George. She smelled of vanilla. "I certainly will," said Mom. "That was beautiful, George. Really beautiful." Ms. Maldonado put her lips close to George's ear and whispered, "My door is always open," before she slipped away. Mom took George by the hand and walked brusquely through the lingering crowd. Once they were out in the hallway, the murmurs from the auditorium were quieter and their footsteps echoed. Outside, it was dark enough that the street lamps had turned on, but the sky still held a bit of light. Mom jiggled her keys in her palm. Neither she nor George said a word. At home, they watched a dancing competition on television as they ate a dinner of spaghetti. Scott was still off at Randy's. George noticed that Mom kept looking over at George. But when George looked back, Mom had her eyes fixed on the television screen, even if it was showing commercials, which she usually hated. Neither Mom nor George mentioned the play that evening, but once George was up in her room, she twirled around and around like a spider dancing on a web. Thanks. See you next time.